discussing PM's visit to Wuhan, meeting with Xi Jinping. Have we given a name to this? Yeah, Informal Wuhan Summit. Okay, now we have a distinguished panel. There are three academics, three scholars, one career diplomat, one naval officer, former naval officer. So it's a very balanced group. And my only qualification of being chair is that I was in Wuhan the same time PM Modi was here. He arrived on the around the midnight of 26th, 27th April, and 27th April morning I left Wuhan. The international office of Central China Normal University was desperately trying to get Indian students to go and, receive Modi at the airport and also, to be at near the hotel. But they didn't quite succeed because most of the students complained that the office did not inform us on time. Okay, we should have known. Suddenly you call and say that there is your Prime Minister is coming and please come. So of course, finally a few students went, but a good number of them could not go. And when this news first came to me, Anita Sharma, my colleague and friend in Delhi University, sent me a WeChat message in which she said that Modi is visiting Wuhan, coming to Wuhan. I thought she must be joking or something because I am in Wuhan through some kind of. So I said, no one here knows about it. So she said, no, even the media. I said the media is not talking about it because nowadays the Chinese media, especially the English language media, gives a lot of coverage to India, which was something really unexpected. It didn't happen all these years. Now regularly, almost every day, every news item, every news bulletin will have something or the other on India. Of course, mostly to do with Indian economy and things like that. But they do give a lot of coverage. Okay, now, so I thought it was just some rumor. And then she said, yeah, people here are also not talking about it, but the Chinese embassy officials told her. So the Chinese embassy officials told her that must be authentic. A couple of days later, I found out that, the Chinese media also found out. So, okay, now we have 5 distinguished speakers. They will speak for about 10 minutes. Then of course there will be the Q&A session. I have only one question here. What did this summit really achieve? Because just a few weeks before this summit was held, India gave a major concession to the Chinese. The Ministry of External Affairs stopped all government officials from attending any event pertaining to Tibet. I think it was a favor to China. In return, did we get anything? I don't know. We have 5 panelists. Let's hope they can give some insights on that. So we begin with Ambassador Vinod Khanna, who is a former director and Emeritus Fellow of ICS and also former career diplomat. He was posted in China and many other places and Bhutan ambassador. He was also ambassador in residence in my department in Delhi University, and we are very proud of Ambassador Khanna.
Thank you, Chairperson, my distinguished fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It's a theme on which already a lot has been written and spoken, etc., etc. I'm not quite sure that I would be able to say anything particularly new. And in any case, the two main interlocutors themselves haven't said very much. And as I say, one would have loved to be in the fly on the wall, or when they were having their walk fly around their head, to have some idea what were they talking about. Now, I'm quickly first reacting to what the chairperson said about this Tibet thing. My own feeling is that it was really not something dramatically new. It was not that the officials were asked not to attend anything relating to Tibet, but to anything which was organized by the Tibetan government in exile, quote unquote. As far as any religious function or anything, certainly, and this is not new. I don't know about Ambassador Goel, but certainly when I was there, we used to request our officials, senior officials and ministers to exercise discretion. But this time it leaked to the press and it became something that tremendous. But anyway, it must have pleased the Chinese. So it's not something sort of in that, and I don't think one should see a summit of this nature in the purely transactional terms. Of course, the question is really, I mean, some people have said that this summit, we were very keen to have this because of the cloud. But it has been pointed out by the former Foreign Secretary, Jaishankar, that the decision to hold the summit was taken earlier at Astana, sidelines of the SCO summit meeting there. But of course, once the program did proceed this, it must have had a major impact on this. I was sort of as to why something like this. I was particularly struck by an article written, in fact, written a few, just when Doklam was beginning, I don't know if it had much to do with Doklam, written by a very good friend of ours of this, our institute, Husha Sham, who really heads the department dealing with India and the most famous of the Chinese think tanks, KK. And he wrote this article, which he entitled Strategic Communication Necessary for Sino-Indian Ties. He says in this article, and I'm just going to quote parts of it, strategic mutual suspicions seem to be increasing. China and India should take efforts to remove and clear the suspicions as soon as possible. Enhancing bilateral trust will greatly benefit Sino-Indian relations and bilateral cooperation in the region. And then he goes on later in the article to say, there are three main ways of strategic communication. One is the face-to-face interaction among the top leaders. And this, he says, is in fact the most important way for him. And he says that this is happening in Sino-Russian, it's happening in Sino-US, and he hopes that it will take place as far as Sino-Indian relations are concerned. Then another article also, in fact, in Global Times, which is saying now the Honorary, and a very interesting piece on why Wuhan. And a different thing, but one of the things which he says is striking. He says, Wuhan is home to historical events during the Three Kingdoms period. Now, this is the early 3rd century. Because of his short-sightedness, the Wu Emperor broke his alliance with the Emperor of the Shu Kingdom and attempted to capture the latter's land, triggering military conflicts between the two states. The Wei Kingdom benefited from the war that weakened Wu and Shu and toppled the two states to end the period of the Three Kingdoms. Then comes the punchline. This is worth thinking deeply about for Chinese and Indian politicians, strategists, as China, India, and the US are a little like the Three Kingdoms. So, now, quickly as to what in fact did the two sides say about the summit at the end of it. And you probably read, there was no joint statement, as you know, and much has been made about that. But it was very clear it would be an informal summit with no joint statement. But each side issued its own press release. And some people have, taken looked at it very closely, and whenever they find a slight difference, and they think, oh my God, this means really tremendous. And I think one particular thing did strike me, and I'll come to that in a moment. Now, of course, as you've heard, that it's been said over and over again that this, at that level, is not really designed to deal with, daily problems. But it says, and this is from our press statement, to exchange views on overarching issues of bilateral and global importance, and to elaborate their respective visions and priorities for national development in the context of the current and future international situation. But there were two issues, concrete issues, which in fact do figure, as it were. One is the border, and the other, from which when people make further comment, we come to Afghanistan thing. On the border, and linked to that, the instruction, direction to the militaries to behave themselves. If you compare the two statements, they are interesting, but I don't want to go into that. All that I want to say is that the two statements of the both sides are interesting in terms of what it said to the militaries, but not in terms of anything in terms of the solution or what progress has been made or is likely to be made on the border issue. And one has now got used to the unfortunate fact that India and China no longer mention the agreement on political parameters and guiding principles for the settlement of the boundary, which was signed during the visit of Premier Wen Jiabao in April 2005. The other thing which is, sort of interesting about the two statements, this is one difference which one finds striking, is that the Chinese statement has, and I quote, both sides agree that the two countries will continuously enhance mutual trust, carry forward the fine norms enshrined in the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, a stellar example of joint initiative by two countries. Indian statements before, during, after make no reference to the Panchshila, and you would have to draw your own conclusion, considering who was the original author on the Indian side of the 5 principles. The other interesting thing on the positive side, which one sort of was struck with, and clearly it figured prominently in the discussion with the two leaders. And I first will quote you from what the Indian side has to say, and what this matching sort of statement from the Chinese side. Please tell me in a couple of minutes before I have 2.5 minutes. So the two leaders agreed that as two major countries and emerging economies, India and China, given their vast developmental experiences and national capacities, should join hands to take lead in offering innovative and sustainable solutions to challenges faced by humankind in the 21st century. These include combating diseases, etc., etc., etc. They agreed to pool together their expertise and resources in these areas and create a global network dedicated to these challenges for the larger benefit of humanity. And there is a Chinese side. Both sides agree to promote more active regional and international cooperation. They agree to join hands in offering innovative and sustainable solutions to global challenges such as epidemics, natural disasters, climate change, and terrorism, and so on. And of course, later we were told about this very important agreement from a joint project in Afghanistan. Of course, apparently this was also first figured in 2010 in the talks between the special representative. Nothing came of it then. Hopefully something will come out of it now. It must not have pleased Pakistan, the statement, but some might even see this as a clever sort of finessing of the disagreement on the BRI. Here you found a way of agreeing on something in this region without having to get into the differences relating to BRI. I just want to conclude. It was an important meeting. It was an important meeting. We cannot have a situation of heads of these two very important countries meeting over such long periods of time, one-to-one, and in delegation, and it not being important. But at the same time, this is not the sort of thing clearly on which one can get euphoric, as if this standard term like milestone and historic, etc., etc., etc. These are all right. Even through these terms, we as diplomats learn to throw this into our vocabulary, pull out thesaurus and make, dramatic statements. But it's important. Let's not be euphoric about it. The major problems, bilateral problems, were not really, addressed. But there's going to be peace and tranquility in the border. There are things on the broader international scale in which we'll be able to cooperate. The main thing really, as I see it always, in terms of our, there is the power differential. There is, getting away from the fact that there is a power differential. Which doesn't mean that we are unimportant to China. Just as there may be power differential in relation to our neighbors around us, and they're important to us. But I think really, ultimately, what has to be done is that we have to, it's in our hands, to improve our economic situation, our military capabilities, and our relationship with our neighboring countries. And then I think India-China relations will move in that strategic direction. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was insightful, but let's see what others have to say. So can I now request Prof. Mohanty to come? 10 minutes.
I thought I'll do the last one.
Unless someone wants to speak.
Okay. Well, now. All right. Great to be back speaking here. I was reminded of similar discussions in the days when G.P. were around. Some of us have participated. So out of that group, Patricia, Vinod and I, General Banerjee has been with us always. What would be, and Thamchung's presence here, he's in Chicago. What would be the distinct thing that Giri would emphasize? Some of those deep philosophical civilizational issues. So remembering that, I thought of making a few points. Asking 3 questions. Did they work as civilizational actors? Did the 2 leaders work as civilizational actors? Did they exhibit a global perspective that was distinct? And the third is, did they represent explicitly their own people's aspirations about themselves and the world? So I will address these 3 questions very well. You can see that such questions are not generally discussed in most forums, newspaper conferences. Therefore, I would like your reaction to this. I have a feeling that the Indian discourse on India-China relations in particular and foreign policy in general has been so dominated by opinionated bureaucracy and international think tanks having branches in India that the more deeper historical, civilizational questions have gone to the background. Therefore, it's very important to raise these issues. Now, between Ahmedabad, Xi'an and Wuhan, occasionally we saw glimpses of the civilizational elements, but basically they were the power players. That's what they are being pushed to be, power players. Well, I'm glad Vinod referred to that Global Times article recalling the 3 kingdoms. But again, the 3 kingdoms analogy was played up by global times and our commentators as power players rather than three streams of thought or interacting civilizational processes at a time when the whole world is confronted with several important global issues. So my answer to my first question is something like C, not really as civilizational actors. Both, not just one of them. I think we need to see them more as civilizational actors who connect the present issues of concrete issues of power, development, climate change, and all those issues to some of the abiding historical issues. Second, did they exhibit global perspective? I have always felt that whether it is Bush's, that is just W. Bush's America or Donald Trump's America, Obama probably was a little different, but or many of our leaders or Chinese leaders, they work as leaders of big countries and not great countries. There is a good deal of difference between the two. Unfortunately, in Chinese, that can be both big and great, but we know the difference. Mohan and Virat. Virat is popular, you can be fat, big, giant burger, okay? But to be a delicious dish is different. They have in these two statements about global cooperation and so on. But four very crucial issues which our own countries are facing: climate change, rising inequalities on so many fronts, social, regional, gender, and many other kinds of social groups, ethnic and so on. Climate change, inequality, and climate change is such a big issue. And violence, terrorism, counter-terrorism, crime, this is such a big issue. And finally, alienation, disaffection, suicide rates in both the countries, not just farmer suicides. In other words, the globe and globally, these trends are global trends as a result of the military and economic as well as cultural and communication monopolistic policies which have emerged during the last three decades particularly, or even more. And the whole world is boiling with this contradiction that sees struggle for transition from global hegemony to global democracy, whereas both these power players are behaving like competing hegemons in different spheres, whether South Asia or other countries and so on. And then when it becomes difficult, like in Bhutan or anywhere else, they try to have some discussions and summits, formal, informal, and many other negotiations. Indeed, neighborhood trust, that's a beautiful and very, very good but neighborhood and global, neighborhood, continental and global are so interconnected that you cannot have a neighborhood policy without having a policy towards US or Japan and so on. So the interconnection of these is so important. Third, did they address people's problems, people's aspirations? In case of China, you see Xi Jinping's grand strategy of China in the new era, 2035, 2049, the 2 centuries celebrations, goals and so on, great modern socialist power and so on by 2050. So China, Make in China 2025, Modi's Make in India, New India. Unfortunately, the Indian media hasn't picked up that too well, but Modi does talk about New India. And I remember we had these expressions, shared future, and India, China having a shared future going to, I think, 2010. This is one statement that Mohanty and Japan. Now, what I'm saying is that how the domestic and the international, did they need this meeting for domestic reasons? Modi preparing for 2019 election, Xi Jinping reducing tension points at home and abroad, whether it is counter-terrorism, Xinjiang, Tibet, and India-China border like Wuhan issue and so on, and these competing tensions in all the South Asian countries between India and China. Now, let me conclude by two suggestions. Yeah. I think it's the informal stuff. I call it a milestone, by the way. It is a potential milestone. I have a adjective.
I have no disagreement.
I would consider this in the same range, potentially. We don't know what will happen and what all can happen. 1988, 2003, Vajpayee BJP would set up the special representative framework. Now, what are the special representatives doing? They're not supposed to discuss the whole gamut of India-China relations. They are supposed to discuss the border. So, number one, borders should be pursued, boundary dispute negotiations should be pursued by the SR with three clear committees. Delimitation Commission, where already there is agreement of LSC to be. You don't have to declare what are those areas and we have agreed and so on, but start working on that and complete that. Then disputed areas dialogue group where negotiations go on. And then border movement management and monitoring group where they inform each other. And the SR should respond to all these three issues continuously. And it should not be a part-time job, and when they meet they do India-China relations whole thing. Number two, I think, and here it is India who I think has an opportunity, because China is obsessed with a great power agenda. India should not have a great power agenda. It should have a great inspiration as a power. Gandhi 150 birth anniversary next year. This year is Marx 200th anniversary last week. These are great moments in history. And I think India should use its freedom struggle legacy, Panchasheel, Bandung, and India's third world anti-colonial solidarity legacy to build a framework that is an alternative to Chinese and American. It should concentrate on the issue of an alternative development paradigm, reducing inequality, addressing climate change, and making whatever minimal goals in the SDG there are to seriously pursue. Number one. Number two, India should actually actively come up on global issues, whether it is terrorism incidents, whether it is other humanitarian issues, political issues. India should not feel that it has unequal GDP or military capacity. India should be a civilizational actor with a civilization that had produced Gandhi, Buddha, and it's a vibrant democracy where social movements have this other agenda. Social movement's agenda, unfortunately, is not informing our foreign policy. And that is where we have to rethink on such movements.
Is a potential milestone, or the both are behaving like competitive arguments? And of course, civilization aspect is to be given importance. Thank you, very interesting. Now, can I request, no, I'm requesting Dr. Jabin T. Okay, he is agreed to fight. Dr. Atul Bhardwaj.
Third question, my focus actually has not really been China because I don't really know China so well. I know India well, and so basically my study is concentrated on how India perceives China and how India behaves vis-a-vis China. So when I'm looking at Wuhan, I'm not really able to understand why Wuhan, to be honest. Till now I've not been able to gather why this movement towards Wuhan took place. As a historian, I try to go back into history and try to look at it. What could be the purpose? In our relations with China, we've not really been able to really gather neither the academia nor the think tanks nor the media have been able to gather what is our purpose in our overarching relationship with China. How do we want to approach China? How do we want to react to them? We've not been able to decide on that particular strategy, you must say. If we go back into 50s history, we see that India had a very clear-cut purpose, post-Bandung, I would say. We had a very clear-cut, our elite rather, had a very clear-cut purpose on why they want to oppose China or why they want animosity with China. And that reason was that it was basically to halt commerce, both domestically and internationally. So there was a reason to push for that war. There was a reason that for that animosity to grow. And it did bring them results because it helped the Sino-Soviet split and it caused a split in the Indian Communist movement. So in that respect, good, bad or ugly, the strategy of the elite was very clear-cut, that we want to oppose China. The border dispute, I think, was not the strategy. It was the border dispute did not create that the animosity. The border dispute was just a kind of a sales brochure which was given to the intelligentsia and to the media to basically sell the war or sell the animosity or the othering of China to the masses. So here we are seeing what is the reason. So there was a very clear-cut, good, bad or ugly reason was to stop communism. But now what is the reason is not clearly being understood. And that's why this confusion, is always revolving around how do we deal with China and why do we deal with China in a particular manner. So one positive outcome of this Wuhan summit, as far as I am concerned, is a sort of, if it sustains itself, is demilitarization of the entire discourse on China. The very fact that there is somebody, I think, evaluated, if at all they have, that over the past year, 10 years, since 2008, since Arnab Goswami started showing a stone in Ladakh, painted with a Chinese inscription, ever since then, the whole discourse on China has been very aggressive from the Indian side. It has been very militarized. Even the diplomats have started speaking the military language. So therefore, when I look at it now, if at all it is true, then there is a kind of a demilitarization of the entire discourse on China. We now have a situation that where we are talking and where we are moving away from the gunboat diplomacy of the Doklam kinds, towards a more pristine, kind of a diplomacy, the yacht diplomacy, which you may say, and so we're moving towards that. But we still need to ask questions, as Manu had also asked this question. Is it the domestic or the international politics that has triggered this sudden change of heart in India? Have domestic factors coincided, or are they militating against the international politics? In simple words, are we challenging the United States by going to China, or are we being dictated by USA? Because their current focus is Iran, and they want a more pacified Asia Pacific. Have we realized that there is a larger context to our relationship? As Manu said, there is civilizational context to our relationship. So have we gone to Wuhan because have we come to this realization that there is a larger context to this relationship with China? And are we willing to accept the Chinese aspirations as a great power, just as we accept American aspirations to be a superpower? Have we realized that is this present movement towards China driven by personality, or is it driven by institutional backing to the idea that the asymmetric China cannot just be managed by poking it regularly? And I'm talking of Indian context only. By poking it with party poopers like you have Masood Azhar, or by stone pelting, by televising those stone pelting incidents, or by pushing and pulling on the borders, or even by resurrecting the ghost of '62 war. So India has finally decided, I feel, if at all it has decided, to push the hawks a little away and let diplomats really talk diplomacy. Because over the past 10 years, diplomats had stopped talking about diplomacy. They were just talking about borders and nothing else. They were not talking about how to create conditions for peace. They were more talking in terms of how to create more confrontation with China. So this is important, because why this is important to know, and why it is important for us to know the strategy behind the whole deal. Because there is every possibility that the current economy may not last long, or the current bhai slogans that we are now getting used to may be used to create a fresh story of Chinese betrayal. Now, it was done in the 50s, but should we get it repeated in the 21st century is the question that we must ask. Because it involves cost. It involves cost to people. We were driven into the '62 war, but what were the consequences of it for the people? We had a severe financial crisis in 1966. We lost many people. So it becomes very important for both academia and the think tanks to actually get to the root of why this is happening now. Because unless and until we get to the root of this, we'll only be analyzing based on the sales brochures which are handed over to us.
Interesting Indian perspective to this issue. I like your expression, moving towards your diplomacy from gun to diplomacy. Okay, so thanks for keeping to the time. Now, may I request Dr. Jabin T. I'm cheering it, my teacher sitting here and I'm cheering it. If that is possible, you are
Okay, so before I begin, let me just acknowledge that there are people standing outside as well. And I think it just proves my point that if you have a good topic or a good panel or both, we don't really have to run to the IIC to organize ICS events. I am titling my presentation the Wuhan Delusion, and I think that will give you a sense of where I'm headed with about. This particular summit is very interesting. Because for once we have the left-leaning, the right-leaning, the centrists in India all agreed that this is a good thing. My problem with that is that each of these parties thinks it was a good thing for different reasons. And that is, well, who can complain about engagement? Engagement and meetings are like mother's milk. Nobody can complain about it. But the question is, what are we hoping to achieve? What do you think we have achieved, and where do we go from here? Some of these issues, of course, have been raised by the previous speakers as well. I think it has been, in terms of what we were hoping to achieve, it's been acknowledged that this did not come up suddenly. I think, sir, you mentioned it was brought up since Astana, the SEO summit. Somebody else mentioned it was brought up from Xiamen, the BRICS summit. And I think it's rather clever of leaders on both sides to say that there were no expectations or low expectations. That way nobody can complain that what the result was. If there are no expectations, no results means fine. And while it is called an informal summit, seen as something new, actually the preparations were fairly formal. Everything, of course, both sides discuss, and the fact that they've discussed several months means that a fair amount of work went into this. Now, what did we achieve? There's this brilliant line, one can take it in many ways. This is not outcome oriented but understanding oriented. Now, depending on where you stand, this is either classic bullshit or it's great diplomacy. This is not about specifics, it's about the strategic picture. So what's the strategic picture? Has anybody understood what the strategic picture is now, and what is the strategic vision? I think by saying and putting all these lines, it's just another way of, at least from the Indian perspective, another way of saying that this was about domestic politics. If I want to continue to be rude, I would just say this is time pass politics, time pass photo of diplomacy. I think it was mentioned here that for Prime Minister Modi, there is a concern about domestic elections coming up in 2019, several state elections at the end of this year. So he needs to keep the situation on the border calm. On the Chinese side, it has been referred. There has been reference made to the situation on the Korean Peninsula, the trade war with the Americans. So are these reasons for the Chinese to agree to this? Are these reasons for us to agree to this or want this summit? In any case, we have two separate statements. We don't even have a joint statement. That is simple visual of look at the length of the Indian press release and the length of the Chinese statement and the length of how the Chinese and the Indians discuss the same topic shows you the differences that the two sides are. So in a sense, I don't think there has been much bridging of the differences between the two sides. The gulf between the two sides remains open. We have some specifics. For example, Afghanistan. The question one has to ask, well, people have said, well, cooperating with the Chinese in Afghanistan is another way of getting around to accepting or doing business with the Chinese on the Belt and Road. There's also the point made that doing business with the Chinese in Afghanistan somehow puts pressure on the Pakistanis. If you actually look at the record, the same people who make these statements have also been quoted as criticizing the Chinese, as criticizing the Pakistanis for all that they do in Afghanistan, all that they do with India. So from my point of view, to cooperate with the Chinese on Afghanistan is to give away Indian goodwill and pave the way for Chinese to do what they could normally not do in Afghanistan. And if we are expecting the Chinese to somehow make the Pakistanis behave, I don't see what in the record of China-Pakistan relations vis-a-vis India gives us that confidence. Shared understanding has been talked about. If you look at it structurally, two countries the size of India and China, with the kind of aspirations that they have, with the kind of leadership and the politics that the respective governments play domestically, and how they sell their foreign policy to the domestic audience, taking into account all of that, I'm not sure, how the two countries will have any sort of shared understanding, not for the foreseeable future. And this, I come to the problem. Professor Mohanty talked about the civilization aspects, how popular aspirations they represented. I think this is very important. Do the two governments represent popular aspirations? And if so, is that a reason for why India and China can come together? And the first point is, while in India we certainly have elections, we have a claim for the government to represent popular aspirations, I don't think that this claim can be made in the same way vis-a-vis China. In fact, this Three Kingdoms example in the Global Times that Ambassador Khanna raised is actually quite interesting. This is exactly how, when you look at the civilization aspect, and while the Chinese talk a big deal about civilizational ties, we also do that. But for them, civilization is examples like the Three Kingdoms, power play, While as for us, civilization is talking about Gandhi, about Tagore, and for us, civilization is somewhere in the stratosphere. Whereas for the Chinese, civilization is much more grounded. And I think that is a problem. Second problem is it's extremely personality driven. On the Chinese side, we have Xi, and on the Indian side, we have Prime Minister Modi. And I think we have made a mistake. It's kind of akin to what we had in the emergency in India. What is it? What was it saying? India is Indra, Indra is India. So we have gotten to the stage where Xi Jinping is China, China is Xi Jinping. And therefore, because Xi Jinping is all powerful, we assume that China is all powerful and vice versa. Similarly here, we've already had some talk of India is Modi, Modi is India. And if the relationship between what we claim is a democracy and China is going to be based on personality, and again I think institutions was talked about, I think we have a problem on our hands. We are actually playing the game according to the Chinese rule book. We are supposed to function on the basis of institutions, processes. We are not, personalities are important. I think the point was made that we've had to rely on personal diplomacy because of frictions in the relationship. But if you look back very clearly, the frictions in the relationship over the last couple of years was precisely because of the nature of the leaders and political organizations in power. It's precisely because of personality that we have had frictions in India-China relations in the last couple of years. Is the nature of the political parties that rule in both countries that lead to friction, and which also means that there will be a problem going forward. So we simply cannot replace formal processes, institutional development. Professor Mohanty mentioned the special representatives by personalities. And especially when at the end of this informal summit, we have nothing but really by which to assess outcomes. Remember, this is not outcome oriented, it's understanding oriented, whatever that means. So why do the Chinese agree to it? This is also something that as China watchers we should understand. So I already said, I'm not quite convinced whether Korea or the trade war with the Americans necessarily changes Chinese attitudes towards India. And in any case, as a smart realist, if the Chinese are under pressure and they have put us under pressure for so many years on energy, etc., etc., is that the time to take your foot off the pedal? This thing about the Tibet flip-flop was mentioned. Ambassador Khanna, as you say, this is nothing new. What is the need for reiterating this entire thing time and again? If it was not, okay, it was not leaked. If it was not supposed to be leaked, there was no point to reiterating this within the government. And really, this only strengthens the impression for the Chinese that look, the Indians can never stick to a position for long enough. Give it time, give it enough pressure, they will eventually change their position. And that's not the sort of image that you want to be conveying to the Chinese, especially at this juncture. On terrorism, this is something I've argued for several years now. We talk about cooperating with the Chinese on terrorism, hand in hand and so on, but we have no common understanding on terrorism. The Chinese do not accept our definition, our problem with Pakistan as, involving terrorism. So we do not have agreement. Essentially, we sink to the lowest common denominator, which is the Chinese position on terrorism, which is anything that is dissent, anything that opposes the central government becomes terrorism. India not inviting Australia to the Malabar exercises, again this was mentioned as one way of sort of connected to this informal summit. If that's the case, then we are either serious about our relationship with other countries or we are not. And if our relationship with other countries are going to be tied to the China factor all the time, then I'm not sure how this helps us. This point about Hu Shishang and strategic communications, I think this is very important because Hu Shishang has been talking about strategic communications for quite a long time. But I would make a distinction between how the Chinese talk strategic communication with the Russians and the Indians on the one side and the Americans on the other. For the Russians and the Indians, this is as we say in Hindi, maskalaga. These two guys are somewhat in dire straits or comparatively poorer straits compared to the Chinese, so you got to keep them in good humor. Remember, the Chinese were the first to come out with the book on Modi the moment he was elected, translated into Chinese, and so this is part of this personal diplomacy. Let's not be taken in by this. Finally, on the way ahead, I am all for the demilitarization of the discourse, but we should also understand what is the discourse in the first place, or what our approach should be. There is no substitute, and this will be mentioned, there is no substitute for us strengthening ourselves, our economic development, and so on. And finally, yes, the neighborhood, the regional, the global are all connected, but without the Prime Minister resetting, let me use that phrase, resetting his neighborhood first policy, without us fixing our relationship with Pakistan and our neighbors, there is no way we can fix our relationship with China. If we don't do that, and we are essentially outsourcing our policy with our neighbors to China. We are essentially outsourcing Pakistan policy to China. So that's not the way aspiring global powers operate. Thank you.
The important point you made was that this was not an outcome-oriented meeting, but a understanding-oriented meeting. And then the nature of political leaders and political parties probably determine the reason which leads to friction. So something worth thinking about. Okay? Now, Alka, shall we?
Thanks. Thank you very much for providing me with such useful talking points, because I really hadn't come with any kind of specific framework for this. So, in one sense, it's going to be a responding to because I think a very varied set of ideas have come up. Important, but no cause for euphoria, potential importance, purposeless to delusion. I think we've got just about all perspectives on Wuhan, and the truth, as they say, lies somewhere in the midst of all this. I think we need to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. We need to be clear about what exactly are the issues. When I say chaff, I mean that the euphoria on the one end and the extremely hard kind of assessments, some of which came out of the presentation, at the other end. See, we start with this whole thing about, yes, why? why did it come about at this time, and the fact that this was the first informal summit between India and China. So what the purpose, I think the whole point of an informal summit is to just sit together and talk. And was there any reason to talk? I think plenty. In the last few years, the downhill that we have seen in the relationship, some of it explicable and some of it frankly quite unexplicable, had brought a lot of issues to the table. The demilitarization of the discourse was one part of it, but the fact was that just about everything appeared to be going wrong with this relationship. Apart from a very general statement about how there were some commonalities between India and China at the local level, we seemed to be standing on two ends of the spectrum on just about every issue, operating at the regional level or bilaterally, of course, there were examples. So where was the meeting ground? And even the summits, the formal summits that were happening, came out with prepared kind of joint statements and communiques. And those were accompanied with a lot of euphoria, I thought. The Xi'an movement and then the Ahmedabad movement, those were the ones which were hyped up beyond reason. So I don't see Wuhan about euphoria at all. I think it came out with some very sober kind of thinking about where exactly the situation is. Not just that it was becoming problematic, that we came to face-to-face for 73 days and rescripting of 62 was being in the air. So the whole point was that this entire period, from the time the two countries start to normalize relations, until now seemed to be like vanishing in because what was this whole normalization and then the framework of strategic partnership and everything all about if it brought you to stand opposite each other on just about every significant issue facing the two countries. I think somewhere this idea of an informal summit, when was it? I think the flavor of this goes back to probably Cho and Nehru's discussions, although there was no informal summit as such, but when you have a situation where the two leaders are sitting down to take stock of the world, of the
Also
region,
traveling and train together.
all sorts of things. Well, of course, all the fun part, let's not deny them the glories of the picturesque spots and so on. But so therefore, I start this by saying that it was necessary for the two countries to talk and figure out, because frankly, I will take the implicit hint in Manu's talk about the discourse being so dominated by on the one hand, the bureaucratic kind of positions and assessments, and on the other hand, the military. That in fact the Sino-Indian agenda had literally been hijacked in one sense from the political realm into the bureaucratic. So I will make a slightly strong point, because I did not see political intervention of the kind that brought about major landmarks. So I'm not therefore reaching to the point immediately to say that this is a political intervention of that kind. Let's not forget that it's an informal summit. But I'm saying that this was an attempt to reclaim political ground. So was it about the big picture? If it's an informal and you wanted to take stock of the situation and the big picture, unfortunately one does not get that sense, because we don't get much of a report back into it, and looking at the length of the communiques from either side, and that's not how I would go about it. In an informal summit, you don't use the normal or the usual kind of parameters to assess the outcomes. The outcomes of informal summits will only be seen in due course. Obviously, if it is about the understanding, that is solidly explored. If it is about giving strategic guidance and so on, then we need to see how this pans out. So I would reserve my judgment as to whether this information-oriented, understanding-oriented interaction will produce results. But 3 points that I will also now make about this. I think the first thing to put out there is what, and I'll take off from where what is the perception of this relationship? And obviously we are not talking of just personalities looking at this relationship, we are also talking about different sectors in both the countries looking at India and China and what this relationship implies for each other as well as for the region and the world. There's been enough said about how India and China are going to split the Asian century, that we are going to be the foundation on which Asia is rising, there's enough space. So we have an entire discourse about what the two countries mean to each other in the Asian rise context, and about the fact that these are the two countries which are going to eventually be the leaders 30-40 years down the road. So that part, that has always been there, and yet that big picture has somehow not got translated into policies in the way they should. So clearly there was a gap between the kowtowing to this large picture which we saw in all the formal summits and it actually being translated in the ground. So I think this informal summit needs to actually probe, or should have probed, the problem that where does the shadow fall? That if all this is understood, is known, is reiterated over and over again, then what is the problem? In other words, between the strategy and the tactics falls the shadow. And what is the shadow? I think the shadow is coming out of this famous trust deficit that we keep talking about over and over again, which I have argued is not so much of a trust deficit, but it's an information deficit. Frankly, there has been this great edifice which has been put up there without adequate understanding of how these two countries have evolved in the last 30 years. No contacts between the different communities on either side. Scholars are estranged, like, there's just no dialogue between scholars. There is no interaction among the young community on both sides. Social level, we just have no idea. So clearly, you can talk about these grand ideas, but when it came down to policy, you were stuck with the same problem. Well, can we trust the Chinese? So I think somewhere, part of attending to the big picture is also how to translate it on the ground. And I think that's where we will need to work on this shadow. The second point which is about the weak institutionalization. That again, personality driven and so on, but the fact remains that there are most institutions between the top levels and within the bureaucratic levels, which can actually strengthen this process of interaction, exchange, information. Look at the barriers to giving visas to the scholars, look at the mindsets that operate. Even the few institutions that we have set up, which would work very well, have unfortunately just fallen by the wayside. This great India-China think tank forum that was announced with such enthusiasm a couple of years back seems to be becoming another ground for think tank, not so much indigenous think tank oriented from our side, but more the influence of certain non-Indian perspectives. So, point is that this institutionalization where the two sides can talk and different sections of the two sides can talk to each other directly have to be. It cannot be the case that you only have political, which is again at the very top, and bureaucratic interactions dominating India-China. And that's where Manu's point about the fact that how do you make a relationship people-oriented when there is such a big gulf between the peoples on both sides? So by default, what we are doing is examining the policy, and something of what Jabin's argument is actually reflective of that, that you put your magnifying glass on what the Chinese are doing, what is their intention, do we actually make any, can we trust them in terms of what we are saying vis-a-vis Pakistan, because that. So essentially it becomes just about judging policy. The last point that I'm going to make is about the fact that where, and this is where when Modi and Xi Jinping met, was it a domestic politics that was driving it, or who's bringing this? Was it the interest of the West that is coming in? I'm increasingly inclined to believe that it was the domestic dynamics of both countries which was driving this. Both India and China today are clearly critical to the kind of development that they want to see in the next decade. Modi ji is far too astute a businessman to not to realize that if at this point anybody can actually help him with his developmental agenda, it's only China. And the Chinese know that the only market that exists from Southeast Asia and into Central Asia, which is why it is being. So how is the meeting ground going to be? I think this informal summit was about paving the way for pushing the economic agenda. At the end of the day, of course, we can mention a whole variety of factors, Trump and the uncertainties, Pakistan, BRI, Afghanistan, terrorism. Obviously, they would figure, but we can't really bring everything in and say that, okay, so we need to isolate. And for me, I personally would isolate the domestic economic agenda for both as actually, so let me start.
So, in other words, since the relationship was going nowhere, we needed to talk. And therefore, by itself, this summit is CBM, even if it did not talk about CBM specifically. Right? So it was CBM, and the informal summit was pushing the economic agenda of the countries. I think I quite tend to agree with that, because in China, there is a real fear, I felt, that China's economy may further go down here. There is this fear. So I think that way this is a really important. Anyway, thanks very much. Thanks to all the 5 panelists for very brilliant presentations. And now the floor is open for discussion. And please, since we have a big gathering, let's not ask more than one question unless there is time to extend. So we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A. Okay, let's go ahead.
It's not a question, but it's a comment which could actually raise quite a few questions. I think having really seen the relationship evolve over the last more than 6 or 7 decades, at least since our independence, and also comparing with the kind of a state of relationship that has existed between India and China, not now, but even more than 1,000 years ago, when India and China were the 2 major economies. My one submission would be that one should not expect a relationship of trust or complete friendship between the 2 countries, India and China, as neighbors who will always be aspiring to be an influential factor, if not globally, at least in the region. It didn't happen in the past, it is not likely to happen now. So I think essentially we are going to have to look at how the 2 countries, which will keep on fluctuating between big power or small power, whatever it is, but how they can actually manage this relationship so that it does not actually go over the key. I think that's the first thing that, one submission that I would like to make, to really see how this relationship is going to be. After a long time, it has happened that India and China does see that India, given time, could emerge as another competing power in the region, even if not a big power, but compete with China. And in that competition, India has actually shown enough aspiration to be an influence in the region. So I think essentially over the last 1 decade, at least, what we have seen is, in my own sense, is that there is a greater conflict between the two countries in terms of their own aspirations for influence and how much they can actually do it. So Wuhan, for me, would appear to finally have two strong leaders wanting to manage this relationship, which actually may not really be, like USA and the Western Europe, but which would be confrontational and competitive, and yet how not let it go to essentially a conflict now. And in that sense, I would say I would agree with what Ram Madhav said. It was understanding oriented at the top level, so that before any situation could really be the trigger, it could be managed. And in that sense, I think I agree with what Alka said. It was important, not in terms of details. The details were important, but the summit itself was not important in terms of detail. The summit, I think, was important to really make the two strong leaders see what they can do to let the relationship not go under.
Thank you. Unless someone wants to react to what Mr. Gill said? Okay. Okay, yeah, please. Yeah, please.
Sir, you mentioned about the difference between civilizational definition of India and China. So what is there a government official line by India on what this civilization is? And would this definition be different under, say, a UPA or a Congress government? And to ma'am, you mentioned that domestic factors are more likely to have been the reason behind it. Was the Chinese domestic factor largely economic, or did it assume any strategic elements?
Captain Bhardwaj from National Maritime Foundation. It struck me also that after Xi Jinping's corporate diplomacy named the leader, it was the first time Prime Minister of India here. And rather than have a formal meeting, an informal is a better idea to understand as to where does Xi Jinping want to take China and what are India's reactions. Getting back to the issue where we have this debate on whether it should be a formal or informal meeting, I think at this stage, and you must know that it's been preceded by the new Foreign Secretary's visit, the NSA, and the Defense Minister, in January. Sorry, Foreign Minister also have been there. This has been, I think, a testing ground also to see what is on Xi Jinping's mind, especially with respect to nation.
I'm failed to understand that how the narrative drastically changed, like U-turn. Few months back, we were talking about banned Chinese firecrackers and all those. And both Chinese media and Indian media was like fighting war. Even the tone of Global Times was drastically changed. I don't know how come this change happened and what the purpose. I mean, how it happened suddenly.
Any reactions from the panelists on the questions? No, I think some more. Some more? Okay. Any more questions? Yes.
Ma'am, to you, when you were there, in the beginning you said that you met. Were you there in their talk or not?
Asking you. Sorry. Say that again, please. Sorry.
In the beginning you mentioned that you were there at Wuhan when Prime Minister came there. in this connection, were they in the meeting, or not?
I should have clarified, I had gone there a month before that as visiting faculty to Central China University. I had no idea that there was any visit from India. Just a few days before the visit, I got to know. And I was leaving on 27th morning, 26th night, Prime Minister arrived. And as I said, the foreign students office there was trying to get all Indians to go and go to the airport and go to the hotel where Mr. Modi was staying. And some students were angry with the foreign students office that they did not inform them on time. They made other plans. So I had nothing to do with this meeting. It was just coincidental that I happened to be in Wuhan and Prime Minister visited me.
Oh, we are so many. I said, okay. It's all right.
Yes, okay.
Fair enough.
Will anyone respond to the... No.
I think Ambassador Gore's point, I mean, I'm completely in agreement with this. This is not a relationship where people have 100% trust. It's not possible. Structurally, that's what I argue. It's just not possible. But I think it's important to underline that this is a political challenge that we face from China. This is not a military challenge. Essentially, it's about politics. It's how the two countries, the two systems see the world and how they want to shape the world as they see it. And I will, then I'll come to Dara's point, the civilization. Of course, the UPA and the NDA see civilization as two entirely different things. Of course, that goes without saying. And I think partly the conflict within our country is this challenge. I mean, if you take a simple thing of how does the present government's forebears look at the map, Tibet, Xinjiang are all part of this map. Literally part of the map for them. So it's in that way it also conflicts with the Chinese understanding of it. But otherwise, the stratosphere and ground earth difference is there between the Indian and Chinese thing. But to Ambassador Gore, I have another question. I mean, this is two strong leaders wanting to manage the relationship. But is that the maximum aspiration that we can have of two strong leaders, just manage the relationship? I mean, I've also written that if anything, these two strong leaders with the kind of influence and popularity or strength that they have domestically should be resolving the boundary dispute, not setting their eyes any lower than that. But that's not happening, for whatever reason. But maybe...
No, maybe I would say yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
Very briefly, yes.
Okay. Well, let's keep our fingers crossed. Captain Parmar, I mean, yes, you could say, this informal is just a name tag because after all the NSA, the Raksha Mantri, the foreign minister, they've all met, they've all sort of done the spade work. So why call it informal? Which is precisely my problem. If you are taking it to the level of two countries the size of India and China being dependent on two individuals to run the relationship, then it might work for China, but it just doesn't work for India. I mean, as a citizen who wants to know what is going on vis-a-vis his government, I find it objectionable. So I think, again, this is a political issue. We either accept that there's a due process that we should follow in every aspect of our civil and political life, or we depend on karma or God or the individual. So, I mean, that it just doesn't work in India. It shouldn't work in India. How does the U-turn come about so rapidly? Perception management. And I think that's the army, the forge has this exact expression, perception management. The point is, were things as bad as they were, despite the media claiming, having shooting matches in the press, despite this call for banning Chinese firecrackers, were things as bad as that? Were things as bad? Or now, the flip side is, are things as good as they are made out to be right now? So again, I'll refer you to what Ambassador Gore said. I don't think things are either very bad or very good. It's up to us to decide what we need to make things better.
Yeah, I will later.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
questions there were.
Okay.
I just a question to what Jabin said. If this is about two competing visions of the world, and I'm very naive, so would you enlighten me about what is India's vision?
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Christian Barma, Overseas 7. I just wanted to check or at least get an assessment as to how the Chinese have been reacting to this. Have you been seeing how the response has been extreme in their media following this? What are they saying about it? How much importance are they giving? How much of a takeaway do they think they've actually got out of it? I mean, let's be realistic. Let's come to the ground level. And I think I share a lot of views which Jabin mentioned. I think they've got away with a lot. One of the most good ever technical people. Some young people, how it's going to take on the
Any other questions? Yeah.
So I have a question in terms of Chinese domestic policy. So as the economic development factor was mentioned by you, that there is a fear of declining economic growth. After the Made in China plan of 2025, there have been news that Chinese government are intervening in private Chinese company. They're roping in for their R&Ds and basically tightening their grip on the Chinese private companies. So how do you think, or how does the panelists think that will affect the graph of the growth of economic, whether it will go downhill, or what is the assessment on that area?
Very simple response is that the economy is the strategy. It's not about whether domestic factors or what about economy, because I think somewhere the understanding that unless you have built a substantial economic foundation, you're not going to get into that position where you can then actually start. So to that extent, and as far as China is concerned, see, the question is that yes, Xi Jinping has now amassed great powers, and yes, he has he's now there for the foreseeable future, and yet he is going to be facing some of the most challenging economic reforms in this next decade. And clearly at that point in time, the requirement of this BRI to take off, which can then inject a fresh ease of life into many of the existing shifting out of the industries and so on. So that there are all sorts of interlinkages inside into the economy. Clearly, if India cannot be brought on the BRI, on board the BRI back, at least to be able to neutralize it along the edges. I think somewhere there was a sense that it needn't become a point on which the two countries fall apart. So that's where I will take that. See, it's very interesting that the kind of questions that are coming up are only veering around the power dynamics again. Now, so if we are saying that the two leaders are meeting to say, okay, let's see now which is going to be your arena and which is going to be our arena, again, that could really be, but the point you said about China has gotten away with a lot. It had gotten away with a lot 10 years ago. Actually, the question that Mr. Modi is now facing, and this asymmetry, is something which is now determining this relationship. Not 10 years ago, we were still talking about China being 10 years ahead of us, operating in our region, and we were finding that difficult. Today, your space is getting more and more constrained. And I think Prime Minister Modi is astute enough to realize that to take on the Chinese at this point when you are not having the necessary makes no sense. You've backtracked and backtracked and backtracked because there is no space for what is your leverage? Where is your maneuverability? So I think if we have to talk about realism dominating Mr. Modi's agenda, yes, it was a recognition that this is the time we need to have some kind of a quid pro quo. The quid pro quo is that yes, we should contribute to each other's development, and we should try and not put the head of each other's shoulders too much.
Last comment, please. 1 second.
Let the panelists answer, then you can give your
Atul was saying.
Yeah. So basically what Alka has said, relationship, the fact is that we have asked for the summit. China has not asked us for the summit. We asked them that we want to be there. The summit was informal because the Chinese, worked out the details very well. They know Prime Minister Modi likes the big screen. He likes, like in a Bollywood movie, he likes the entire focus of the camera to be on the hero and the heroine on the big screen. So, Chinese had worked it out wonderfully well, and we asked for it. So, and probably, it is very probable that we have realized the fact that, the kind of decade-long confrontational relationship that we have developed is not working out. The way we tried to manage those asymmetries is not working out. The way we tried to poke China with Masood Azhar, Masood Azhar cannot determine a relationship between India and China. How can one single entity, some terrorist somewhere in Pakistan determine India-China relationship? That is the basis of, and these are the party poopers, as I mentioned. These are not the actual things which need to determine the relationship. So therefore, if that realization has come within the government, that whatever policy we were following to manage the asymmetries was not proper and was not correct, then probably they are moving on the right track now with this particular summit. And they are trying to rejig the entire thinking process within the government, perhaps.
Okay, yeah. Now there has been quite rightly much emphasis on the pros and cons, and indeed the pros and cons of personal diplomacy at that level, which one can spend time on it. But I think, and this is true, that one can see cons in the sense that, a very simple con. So much effort has gone in, and what happened in 2019, the Prime Minister changes. So, relationship at that level cannot really be determined exclusively by individuals. But it's not that, suddenly Mr. Modi was just speaking as Mr. Modi. Behind it, as they were saying, there was a whole sort of preparation that had gone into it, and he must have had all those inputs. So it's not just this. But I think the important fact is that, and again on this domestic considerations, I don't know about the Chinese side, but domestic consideration on the Indian side, true. That is, he's a politician, and therefore he will certainly have domestic political consideration. But I think one would have to recognize, I'm not frankly a great admirer of much that this government does on the domestic field. But as far as external relations are concerned, as far as relationship with China is concerned, though it may have to some extent, 2019 election, the state elections, etc. in mind, though frankly I don't think these are much impacted by what happened in Sino-Indian relations, other than things growing up into a war or something. But I think the fact of this summit was also in the national interest. So it was not just merely in the interest of domestic political interest of the Prime Minister. I said, even though I disagree with him on the whole marine things. No, we could go on endlessly on this Tibet thing, which you asked us to, then why not? The point is that this was a specific event. It's not an event that takes place every year. There is a certain annual event, and I don't want to go into all of this. There is a certain annual event where you would say why, if it is being previously been done, why reiterate it? The point is, there's a new event, and there are new officials on the Indian side, the new ministers on the Indian side, all need to be re-educated, frankly. And if it was leaked and it had sort of pleased the Chinese, that from the point of view of this particular meeting, a bonus. And I just want, I have no disagreement whatsoever with Professor Mohanty on this civilizational thing, even though one may go along with Jabin on different perceptions but it's not, I think I would not put it as such a drastic and complete, one in stratosphere and one in ground reality. I think that Chinese also have a certain also stratosphere approach to what civilization is about. And it is striking, it was striking, and there I would sort of go along with Professor Mohanty, that both in statements of Xi Jinping, there was a constant sort of underlining of the civilizational thing. And politicians sometimes use phraseology and rhetoric which they may not entirely be serious about. But the fact is that here are these two great civilizations. And there is no getting away from that. So, I mean, I disagree entirely with Professor Mohanty when he speaks of this big contrast between the bureaucrats, Indian bureaucrats and Indian civilizational thinking. And Indian bureaucrat is also a product of, and indeed draws a lot of inspiration from being a product of that civilization. I say that to myself. And so
I like that.
I just want to conclude by, as you were discussing, it just struck me, in many ways, I can't get it, there's no point debating whether there was what you call milestone definitions of going to it, but there is an incremental increase. And this reminds me of the title of a brilliant book written by Dr. Alka Acharya on China-India relation, what incremental engagement. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we have run out of time.
I will. I think I will. I said certain opinionated bureaucrats. Not all. Anyway, but I want to make just two big points. The trust discourse is about 25 years old. After the Fukuyama book trust, and then before that anyway, social capital and trust discourse, and then it was transferred to foreign policy and strategic studies. And now everybody is talking about trust. The collective entities do not work on trust and mistrust. These are relationships and a whole range of, there is a whole spectrum of possibilities and relations. And I mean, the Americans raised it to Sino-US strategic trust. We had this big discussion, very good discussion. We have a paper on that. Now, therefore, it's not like brothers or individuals or families, houses, even firms, certainly not states and peoples, and because it's very complicated. There are many layers of interactions and relations. So you can't say trust increase, trust decrease between large collectivities. So that's my first point. I think the reason I regard it as a potential milestone, and may have been a milestone, we will know, if it created a sense of equal status or dialogic discourse, that mutual respect was conveyed to each other, and I take strategic communication more seriously than you have implied. I think there was lack of strategic communication evident during the Chunar 2015, during the 2000. And right up to Chumar to Doklam, there was enough evidence, and not just border things, on so many other things, on economic issues, on cultural issues, fellowships, media, visa issue. I mean, because the framework was missing. The framework that should allow 5-6 kinds of exchanges to continue even in the height of tensions. Student exchange, cultural exchange, sports exchange, science exchange, business deals and things like that. And that the strategic command and the on the ground, the various levels, constant communication. So strategic communication indeed was loosened, if not non-existent. Therefore, maybe this will turn out to be a milestone if we have evolved a framework where the dots are linked and communication lines and certain principles emerge as consensus.
Future will say that.
I have to finish.
You have, okay. Well, we have completely run out of time. Okay.
Yes.
15 seconds.
No, I didn't get it. I think, let me answer Mr.
No, I don't mind if.
We have a five panel thing.
Okay, go on.
See, what is India's mission is actually a very easy question to answer, but it's an important one. The Constitution tells us what it should be. Liberty, equality, fraternity, and this is where the contrast with the Chinese comes in so sharply. Because fraternity is supposed to mean no ethnic chauvinism, no majoritarianism. So this is very clear why we should be different from the Chinese in this way. Equality of nations. Nobody should be reciting the Million Dialogue to the poorer nations, the weaker nations as the Chinese are doing right now. No Tianxia, no hierarchical ordering of the regional or the global order as the Chinese seem to be implying with their Belt and Road Initiative or any number of foreign policy. No intervention in universities constraining the space for freedom of speech, expression. No internet sovereignty, which by the way,
all that is happening in India.
That's exactly the point. Well, that is the lesson that we are supposed to invite, understand. That's the subtext. Internet sovereignty, by the way, is something that we have signed on to in successive BRICS declarations, which I think is a mistake. But this question of confrontation relationship, I think we should also not go the other extreme, where we think that we do not have leverage. We have leverage simply because we are India. And that is where the civilizational aspect, the fact that we are who we are, is important. Because if we say Belt and Road, the Chinese cannot ignore us because of factor of geography. In politics, the Chinese cannot ignore us because of the fact that we are a democracy. The whole problem with this entire informal summit, this tendency towards personalities, the fact that we are headed in a wrong direction right now, is because we risk becoming more like China. And if India looks more like China, then there is no leverage at all that we have with the Chinese or in international politics. And I think that is something that every one of us needs to understand very clearly.
Let's see if anybody has any questions. Anand.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you. Because Marx was mentioned, so let me say, adversary, Marx also said to doubt everything. So my essential question was, which I have been still not found answers even in this roundtable, is why now? And why was the summit held now? In the sense that, and because what Jabin was saying was this was not an outcome-oriented summit, but it was more of an understanding-oriented summit. I mean, both the leaders. What was pointed out was that it is not as if both these leaders had not met on various other meetings and other sidelines. So it is not as if the understanding is not there, or is it just the simple fact that it was only Doklam where it was being said? Because I'm also taking from a lot of commentaries which have appeared. So like scholar Roderick McFarker says that this was essentially the Chinese didn't want the US to join, the Indians to join the US and the Japanese. So that was the essential thing which drove the Chinese to have the summit. And there was there's this question of who offered it first. The Indian media says it is the Chinese who sort of offered it on the first hand to the Indians, and the Indians took time to respond to that call. Or on the other hand, is it the Indians who requested for this and this happened? So essentially what is happening is there is still a lot of non-clarity. I mean, it is not transparent in terms of what has happened, and the non-issuing of a joint communique has only complicated matters. I mean, everybody sort of reads from their own points of view. So what essentially has happened, and why did it happen? Why it happened now? I mean, when there is just a year left for the election, or why at a later level? I mean, this is something which I've still not found any answers. And was it, if it is a win-win, as the Chinese do say, how much has it been in real sense?
Let me see if there are more questions. Because you are going to, yeah.
If I could piggyback on Anand's question about not having clarity, I think I lack a little bit of clarity on why this is still called a milestone and why there are parallels with the 88 visit. Because I wasn't born when Rajiv Gandhi went to China, I sort of went back and read a little bit about, and then this sort of line that outcomes will only be seen in due course was said back then as well. And and there was a lot of writing about a lot of the symbolic things that emerged from that meeting. For instance, the fact that Deng Xiaoping gave him 90 minutes of his time when usually the average for world leaders was 30 minutes. And then the premier hosted another dinner for Rajiv Gandhi. And there were a lot of these symbolic things that were talked about. And the fact that there was a concrete joint statement at the end and they talked about the border agreement and so on. So a lot of the discourse in India, a lot of the scholars have been drawing parallels with this meeting with that and therefore qualifying it as a milestone. But somehow, I don't know, I sort of don't get that correlation. So could you please throw some more light on why you would consider this a milestone event? Thank you. A potential milestone.
If there's no other question, then the panelists will. No other question, so that's okay. Last. And then one last question.
Ma'am, it could be a very naive question, but all the two major potential meetings and summits like the Doklam one and the Informal Wuhan summit, they came just before international organization summit was going to happen, like BRICS or SCO. So like nobody has mentioned it, may be a domestic oriented summit or something, but it might be an image perception for the world also. I see it like that. So if anybody can comment on this. And the second point is why Afghanistan? Yeah, why to touch Afghanistan? Like.
I have one very minor thing. First of all, I'm emerging from this thinking it's still an enigma as far as I'm concerned. But the other question I wanted to ask is about the BCIM. The Chinese spokesperson made an explicit point of saying, with reference to the Belt and Road Initiative, that the BCIM was a prior commitment and a prior engagement. I may be wrong, but I didn't see any response or acknowledgement of that in the Indian, by any Indian spokesperson or commentator. If there is, please correct me. But I thought that was a very interesting thing. And the third point is, in terms of a conceptual framework, I think it was done very nicely so many years ago by Manoranjan, saying there's room enough in the world for India and China to both rise. That's the problem. So, but I did want clarification if the Indian government made any statement on BCI.
Okay, so panelists, one by one.
Okay, well, I thought we were winding up, so I didn't note down what the questions were. But first, something which was originally really not answered, the Chinese media has spoken very highly of this Informal Summit, okay? Including once notorious Global Times, which at the moment seems to be, the change of tone, leading the change of tone. So how long it will last, I do not know. But here too, the question of Professor Mohanty is perfectly right that one should not define trust between nations in the same manner as between individuals. This is an issue in international relations. But still, straight away, you have a situation in which today's Global Times, which I saw just before coming, has this question of the Indian Navy's surveillance of the Chinese ships in the Indian Ocean because they don't trust them, etc., etc. So this will be a continuing thing. The point is not that there is going to be a dramatic change. I mean, on this milestone thing, Well, perhaps Professor Mohanty should know, but I will give my take on this. Okay, it's so much a matter of definition. Otherwise, what is milestone? Number 1 mile, 2 mile, 3 mile, 4. There's nothing dramatic about milestones. In experience, in life, milestone is a milestone. It's going on from Delhi to Agra. On the other hand, it is often used in terms of dramatic, leaps, as it were. Totally altering the very nature of a relationship, which I don't think has taken place. Okay? It's an important incremental movement. Therefore, I think it's important. I began by saying it, but there is no such, what you call. So I don't find this. So it depends on how you use the word milestone. Patricia's thing, since I remember that. Even in the past, the Chinese have said BCIM has not. It precedes BRI. Not the first time that they've said it. And Indians have government has kept quiet then, it has kept quiet now. You know very well the Indian government's position, so I will not go into that. You have interacted with the Indian government on this. You are much better informed than any of us on this issue. There's one other question I'm very keen to answer. No, why now? Because according to former Foreign Secretary Jaishankar, this it's not specifically, this was decided more than a year ago. And and it seems to be convenient for both of them. Both very busy people. I just want to make one comment on what Atul said about how this demilitarization of the discourse. सिर्फ I can say in a Hindi phrase, आपके मुंह में घी शक्कर.
I think that's what we should end.
Would you like to say something?
Well, I'm just going to react to the milestone thing. More in the second sense. You see, it's 2005. 2005, the political parameters on the boundary question. For example, all of us thought that was a milestone. And I still consider that as a milestone. But, the present regime is not even referring to it.
Both sides. Don't just say President Muslim to suggest the Indian government. Chinese government. The Chinese government Indian government would be delighted to reiterate it.
So, no, I agree. The Chinese government also is wrong. But the point is, for example, the 88 landmark milestone, more than that. It's a framework setting Rajiv Gandhi. So, this was not just a BJP or Modi or momentary event. I think I was pointing out, Modi carried the goodwill of the whole country behind this, in this. And even though Rahul Gandhi said, do talk about Doklam boundary, you have our good wishes, we are behind you. Even Rahul Gandhi said that. So, and we will have to allow time to unfold. And the very fact that suddenly the media has changed tone on both sides. And on many fronts, many initiatives have suddenly been revived. So we'll have to give ourselves a little time to make a judgment whether it is indeed a major step or not.
Yeah. Just 2 or 3 points.
Okay, just 1 second. Room enough, has a wonderful framework. Enough room in the world for the two countries to rise. Rise for what? Rise as competing hegemons, frightening the neighboring countries, small powers, and maintaining an unequal world order, or rise as inspirations, as democratic forces to share democracy and civilization with everybody, treating each other as equals, small and big. That is why I think behind that we have to add this is why this Asian century vision is also African century, 21st century. Africa was not like this before. Therefore, perspective on what kind of world we want to create. I think the two countries have to present that. They should.
It's an invitation to put substance.
Okay, so I'll just quickly make 3 points. Number one, why now? This comparison with 88 and outcome. See, the whole point of the argument I was making was that this is not the kind of summit that we are going to use very conventional parameters to judge. It's not going to be that, okay, you put it alongside formal summits and you see joint statement, then you analyze the joint statement, you construct it, what it is. It's not like that. I mean, either you can take the position that Jabin takes, do the pros and cons and say it was a con job, okay? But if you are saying that, let's see, what is this for? What was this about? And I started by saying that why now is, well, it could have happened 10 days earlier, 10 days later, depending on what it means. The fact is that the last 4 or 5 years, in particular, have been disastrous. Where was this relationship going? It was just going down. There was absolutely no communication on vital issues, on everything we were taking positions across. The party papers were always there. So what was there positive about this relationship? And the rest of it, this whole strategic partnership, it was just a kind of an empty shell which lacked substance. So will this now begin the process? We have to wait and see. Comparison with 88 is warranted only to a very limited extent, in the sense that a political initiative is being taken. And that is why I made that point earlier as well, that this is a political initiative. Now whether we asked for it or Chinese asked for it, for the record we asked for it. But the fact is that it is the political leadership which is trying to once again bring about some kind of a positive perception about where this relationship wants to be taken. So 88 put a framework, sure. And I think if there was any kind of tie-up here, that it's time to have a new framework. 88 framework gave us, I think, a very good way to bring the whole boundary dispute on within manageable proportions. But then that's what it became. It just became about management. Manage it, put more, so cut a long story short, I think the time has come to move from management to one who suggested roadmap to active solutions. So I think that these comparisons can be good exercise for scholars and researchers and to see where could be possible things. So outcome, therefore, I'll come back to it, that we are not looking at it in terms of outcomes, which is why we need to analyze what could be the aspects. I think the civilization, people oriented. Once again, India and China reclaiming what was seen as providing a framework for international relations, which would eschew power politics, which would, can we talk about these things? Can we bring them back on the table? Can Modi and Xi do it? I think it's an open question.
Sorry.
No, I think, see, I would go along with the power argument to a certain extent, but the fact is that the power argument stops at a point where human agency should take over. And I think what we are seeing is human agency.
One small point I'll just make. One small point is that, why, the reason for why has come up, and it was mentioned also by New York Times. It's also come up as Mr. Goel said that we had gone there to ensure that the Chinese do not repeat the kind of what Doklam doesn't happen again. And so this would implicitly mean basically that we had spoiled, we are afraid that we had probably Doklam had spoiled Xi Jinping's party, because it happened just before the 19th Party Congress. And so
why should this concern us?
So he might
want to do the same thing to us. So this is basically implying that we have
That was an argument.
It's come out in New York Times.
Okay, so New York Times.
No, and this is what even Ram Madhav has said, Ambassador Goel said, that he mentioned about this. So are we worried about this guy?
Above all, the Chinese motivation is Indo-US relationship will not go too far. And this is well established, it doesn't require too much thinking. Anyway.
Yeah, thanks to all the panelists. Anyway, before, yeah, as the chair of this seminar, I just take advantage and I'll, just say a couple of sentences, which has nothing to do with this Wuhan informal summit. Now, I was teaching a class of about 30 students who were in the first year of their MA at the China Normal Universities, and students of world history. Okay, and the very first day I asked them, when you think of India, just tell me in one word or in one sentence, what is it that what comes to your mind? Just immediately what comes to your mind when somebody says India. Okay? Most of the students said, like software superpower, developing, very speedily developing country, fastest developing economy, young population, powerful leadership, yes, Bollywood films, yoga, all these things. Only one student towards the end said rival. Okay? I said, okay, very good, I'm happy that you are being frank because your other classmates are just pleasing me, right, by saying all nice things. Okay, I'll talk to you later. Anyway, then of course I delivered my lecture, the class was over, but after that, this was the only person I didn't see again in the class. And when he said rival, everybody others looked a little surprised and some of them turned back and looked. Yeah, I don't know what it was. Okay? So I said, I'm very happy you said that because, you're being very frank and open. But after that, I didn't see, at least, I remember the face, but I didn't see him in the class. That's okay, thank you very much.